A heavy, impenetrable fog enveloped Millbrook, Minnesota, this October morning, like a harbinger of the unsolved mystery that had hung over the town for 39 years. Sarah Chung, pulling her coat collar tighter, walked steadily across the construction site, each puff of her breath dissolving into the cool air. As the county's chief building inspector, she had witnessed many unusual discoveries unearthed during excavations, yet nothing in her extensive experience could have prepared her for what she was about to see. Suddenly, Jake Morrison's voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, you really need to see this." The foreman's tone held an uncharacteristic urgency Sarah hadn't heard in their 15 years of working together. The construction crew had completely stopped, their massive machinery frozen like slumbering giants, surrounding a huge, gaping crater in the earth. Sarah approached the excavation site, where Millbrook's new community center was planned to rise. Instead, 20 feet down in the dark, damp Minnesota soil, through decades of accumulated dirt and debris, the distinct bright yellow of a school bus emerged. The vehicle rested at an extremely unnatural angle. Its front end was buried significantly deeper than the rear, as if it had been forcefully driven into the ground, which then swallowed it whole. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, barely audible, as she pulled out her cell phone, her fingers trembling with shock. The numbers 47 were still clearly visible on the side of the bus, in the same distinctive black font she remembered from her own childhood. This was school bus number 47, the very one that had vanished without a trace on May 15, 1986. On that fateful day, it had been carrying 18 young passengers and their teacher on what seemed like an unremarkable field trip to the Natural History Museum in Minneapolis. Instantly, a chilling thought pierced Sarah. Her own daughter, Emma, had been on that very bus. The 7-year-old, her pigtails bouncing with every step, had rushed out of the house that morning, clutching her lunchbox and permission slip. "See you tonight, Mommy," she called out brightly, waving goodbye from the bus window. That was the last time Sarah had seen her daughter's beloved face. The last time she had heard her sweet voice, which used to wake her every morning, begging for chocolate chip pancakes. The official investigation continued for months, then years, yielding no results. Search parties meticulously combed the vast forested areas between Millbrook and Minneapolis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation deployed its most experienced agents. Psychics, private detectives, and numerous amateur sleuths proposed a wide range of theories to explain what had happened. Yet, the bus and everyone inside it had simply vanished into thin air, as if wiped from the face of the earth, leaving not a single trace. Over time, the missing school bus case gradually went cold. It was relegated to the archives, joining thousands of other unsolved disappearance cases that continued to haunt law enforcement agencies nationwide. But Sarah never gave up hope, nor did she ever stop searching. Even as her family life crumbled under the unbearable weight of grief, even when close friends urged her to accept it and find peace, she stubbornly clung to every lead, no matter how faint. Emma's room remained untouched, exactly as it had been on that fateful day. Toys still lay on the floor, and drawings of rainbows and puppies still adorned the walls. Every year, she renewed her daughter's library card and bought her birthday presents that would never be unwrapped. Now, gazing at the buried bus, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, a strange, agonizing blend of hope and profound horror. If the vehicle was here, deliberately hidden beneath what was now a bustling city center, it could only mean one thing. Someone had hidden it. Someone had hidden all of them. "Nobody touches anything else," she told Jake firmly, though an emotional storm raged within her chest. "I'm calling Sheriff Rodriguez immediately. This is a crime scene." As she dialed 911, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the bus, as if trying to penetrate its secrets. Somewhere in that yellow metal tomb, perhaps, lay the answers to the questions that had tormented her for 39 long years. Somewhere there, Emma might be, or at least some trace indicating the fate of her wonderful little girl, who adored horses, strawberry ice cream, and bedtime stories about valiant princesses. The slightly distorted voice of the dispatcher came through the phone. 911. What's your emergency? This is Sarah Chung, County Building Inspector, she began. We found a missing school bus from 1986. The one with 18 children. It's buried at the construction site on Maple Street. On her last words, her voice treacherously wavered. Decades of suppressed emotions threatened to shatter her professional composure at any moment. Ma'am, are you absolutely sure? Is this the bus from the Millbrook Elementary field trip? The dispatcher asked, disbelief in his voice. I'm more than sure, Sarah replied firmly. Send everyone here. Sheriff Rodriguez, the state police, the coroner. Send everyone you can. Hanging up, Sarah noticed Jake and his entire crew had retreated from the excavation site, their faces pale and drawn with shock. She understood their reaction perfectly. This wasn't a typical archaeological find or a frustrating construction delay. This was irrefutable proof that for 39 years, while the families of the missing children grieved inconsolably, searched desperately, and clung to faint hope, someone in their small, close-knit community knew exactly where bus number 47 was buried. Someone had been living among them all this time, meticulously guarding this monstrous secret, watching the unbearable suffering of the families, attending memorial services, and perhaps even participating in search efforts. The horrifying thought made Sarah's stomach clench. Who could commit such an atrocity? Who could calmly watch parents slowly destroy themselves with grief, knowing full well that the truth was just blocks from their own homes? The sound of approaching police sirens gradually began to fill the morning air, growing clearer and louder as they neared the construction site. Sarah pulled out her phone again and quickly scrolled through her contacts until she found the right number. It was Detective Michael Torres, the state investigator who had led the original investigation and, notably, still sent her a card every year on the anniversary of Emma's disappearance. Detective Torres, this is Sarah Chung from Millbrook, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. You need to get here immediately. We found them. We found the bus. A silence so long followed on the other end that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Torres spoke, his voice a mix of profound disbelief and a faint glimmer of hope. Are you sure, Sarah? Are you absolutely 100% sure? Torres asked, trying to process what he'd heard. I'm looking at it right now, Sarah confirmed. Bus number 47 is buried about 20 feet deep at the new construction site. Mike, they've been here all this time, right here in the heart of town. I'm on my way, Torres replied. Don't let anyone near that bus until I get there. And Sarah, after all these long years, we're finally going to get answers. As the first police cars, sirens wailing, pulled up to the construction site, Sarah suddenly found herself uttering a prayer she hadn't whispered since the day Emma disappeared. Please, let her be okay. Please, let all of them be okay. However, even as those words formed in her mind, she knew perfectly well that after 39 years spent in the cold Minnesota earth, hoping for okay was probably too naive. It would be enough for her to get answers. It would be enough to know the truth, no matter how terrible it turned out to be. In just 2 hours, the construction site transformed into something resembling a large-scale military operation. Yellow police tape fluttered in the biting autumn wind, clearly marking the perimeter of what Sheriff Rodriguez had officially declared an active crime scene. News vans from Minneapolis and St. Paul line Maple Street, their satellite dishes reaching towards the gray sky like metallic flowers yearning for light. Sarah stood behind the police barricade, watching carefully as crime scene specialists in sterile white jumpsuits cautiously descended into the excavation area. Every movement was meticulously documented, photographed, and measured. The painstaking exhumation of the bus would take days, perhaps even weeks. After 39 years of waiting, they couldn't afford to miss a single clue. Sarah, a familiar voice, worn by years and likely cigarettes, called from behind her. She turned to see Robert Chris, whose 8-year-old son, Tommy, had been in seat 14 on bus number 47. Robert looked every bit of his 73 years. His hair was stark white, and his shoulders were hunched, as if constantly bracing against unseen blows of fate. Bobby, she said, reaching out to squeeze his hand tightly. Over the decades, they had become incredible friends, united by shared tragedy and unwavering hope. 39 years, Robert whispered, his voice thick with bitterness. 39 years, and they were right under our noses. Right here, where we walk our dogs and buy groceries every day. His jaw clenched. Someone knew, Sarah. Someone in this town knew where our children were, and they chose to stay silent. Throughout the day, more and more parents of the missing children arrived at the construction site. Among them was Margaret Stevens, whose twin daughters, Claire and Chloe, had been celebrating their 9th birthday on the day of the disappearance. David Kim also arrived, having never remarried after the tragic loss of his daughter, Jessica. Elena Martinez appeared, whose son Carlos was known as the class clown, always able to make the other children laugh. They formed a kind of impromptu vigil at the edge of the crime scene. Some sat on folding chairs brought from home. Others stood, arms crossed, trying to ward off the biting cold. They shared hot coffee from thermoses and memories they had carefully preserved and polished, like precious gems, over all those decades. They waited. Detective Torres arrived at the scene just after 3 o'clock that afternoon. His gray hair had thinned noticeably since Sarah last saw him, but his gaze remained sharp and resolute. Despite his age, Detective Torres looked quite fit for a man in his 60s, though the deep lines around his eyes spoke volumes about the weight of the unsolved cases he carried. "Sarah," he said, approaching her by the police tape, "I need to know absolutely everything about this morning. Every single detail, no matter how insignificant it seems." Sarah, step by step, recounted the discovery. The routine excavation, Jake's urgent call, the first glimpse of yellow paint emerging through the earth. Torres took notes in the same worn notebook he'd carried 39 years ago, asking questions that unmistakably showed why he had been the lead investigator on the original case. "Who had access to this site in 1986? He asked, gesturing toward the excavation. "It was just an empty lot back then," Sarah replied. "The Millbrook Community Fund owned it, but it was never developed. Kids sometimes played there, but mostly it was just an overgrown wasteland with brush and old fence posts." "Who was on the Community Fund Board in 1986? Sarah closed her eyes, straining her memory. The Community Fund was one of those civic organizations that existed in every small town that he was responsible for managing donated land and organizing various community events. Harold Brennan was the president. He owned the hardware store. Martha Kowalski was the secretary. She worked at the bank. And she trailed off, a chill running down her spine as a name surfaced in her memory. Frank Delaney was the treasurer. He also headed the school district's transportation department. Torres looked up from his notebook, his gaze sharpening. "The same Frank Delaney who managed the school bus fleet?" "The very same," Sarah confirmed. Nausea washed over her as the implications of this fact became crystal clear. Frank Delaney was responsible for bus maintenance, route planning, and hiring drivers. And he was also on the board of the organization that owned the land where bus number 47 was now being excavated. My God, Mike. Frank was at every search party. He helped coordinate volunteer efforts. He even spoke at Emma's memorial service. "Where's Delaney now?" Torres asked, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "He retired about 10 years ago. Moved to Florida, I think, or maybe Arizona. One of those places Minnesota retirees go to escape the harsh winters." Detective Torres was already pulling out his phone. "I'll need to find him. And I want to talk to everyone involved in the original investigation. Everyone who had access to information about search areas, timelines, the bus's last known location." As evening approached, the crowd of family members at the barricade had grown significantly. Word of the discovery had spread far beyond Millbrook, reaching relatives who had moved away over the decades, but never lost hope for answers. Sarah watched as cars with license plates from Wisconsin, Iowa, and South Dakota pulled up on the blocked-off streets. The media presence also intensified. A reporter from CNN arrived, along with correspondents from major national networks. The story was rapidly gaining traction, becoming a national sensation. Buried school bus found after 39 years. Social media buzzed with a wide variety of theories and speculations. True crime podcasters were already actively booking flights to Minneapolis. Sarah tried to ignore the cameras and microphones pointed at her. She had long realized that media attention was a double-edged sword. It could keep a case in the public consciousness, but it could also turn tragedy into a form of entertainment. Right now, she wanted to focus solely on the bus and the secrets it might reveal. As the sun dipped behind the pine trees bordering the construction site, powerful floodlights were set up to ensure continuous illumination of the excavation. Work continued throughout the night. Every shovel of dirt was meticulously sifted for clues. Crime scene photographers documented every angle, every shadow, every minute detail that could prove crucial in the days to come. Sheriff Rodriguez approached the group of waiting families just after 8 o'clock that evening. His expression was serious, yet also hopeful. It was the look of a man who had finally found a real lead in a case that had haunted his department for decades. "Friends, I want to update you on our progress," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "We have successfully uncovered about 60% of the bus. What we've seen so far strongly suggests that the vehicle was intentionally buried, not here as a result of an accident or natural disaster." He continued, "We found what appear to be construction equipment tracks in the soil around the bus, indicating heavy machinery was used to dig the pit and then cover the vehicle." Margaret Stevens raised her hand. "Sheriff, can you look inside the bus yet? Can you see if—" She couldn't finish her question, but everyone present understood what she was asking. "Not yet, Margaret. The windows are covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris. We'll need to fully excavate the bus and lift it from the ground before we can examine the interior. That process could take several more days." Robert Chris stepped forward. "Sheriff, what about Frank Delaney? Are you going to question him?" Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Detective Torres. "We are pursuing all leads and will be interviewing everyone who had access to relevant information in 1986. I cannot discuss specific individuals, but I want to assure you that no stone will be left unturned." As the families gradually began to disperse for the night, Sarah remained by the barricade. She simply couldn't leave. Not yet. Somewhere in that buried bus was Emma, or at least some trace of her. After 39 years of uncertainty, Sarah wasn't going to miss a single moment of the excavation. Detective Torres approached her as she settled into a folding chair, anticipating a long night. "Sarah, you should go home. Get some rest. This could take days." "I can't," she simply replied. "I've waited 39 years for this. I'm not leaving now." Torres nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Then I'll have one of the deputies bring you some coffee and a blanket. It's going to be a cold night." As Sarah wrapped herself in the police blanket and accepted the steaming cup of coffee, she watched the floodlit excavation site, where her daughter had been hidden all these years. Tomorrow, they would know more. Tomorrow, they might finally get answers. But tonight, she would stay awake, as she had for 39 years, waiting for Emma to come home. The excavation continued through the night without interruption. The incessant hum of generators powered the powerful floodlights, transforming the construction site into a brightly lit island amidst the pitch blackness. Sarah dozed fitfully in her folding chair, wrapped in police blankets, waking each time she heard voices or the movement of heavy equipment. Each time she opened her eyes, she half expected to see the bus fully exposed, its secrets finally revealed. Detective Torres had set up a temporary command post in a borrowed van parked at the edge of the lot. Sarah could see him through the windows, hunched over numerous files and laptops, making endless phone calls, coordinating with state and federal agencies. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been notified, and agents were expected to arrive from Minneapolis by morning. After 39 years, the missing bus number 47 case had suddenly become the state's highest priority investigation. By dawn, the bus was almost entirely exposed. The yellow paint was faded and rusted, but the number 47 was still clearly visible on both sides. The emergency door at the rear was partially torn from its hinges. It was impossible to tell from a distance if this occurred during the burial process or from earlier damage. Other family members joined Sarah's vigil, returning with the sunrise. Robert Chris arrived with coffee and donuts from Millbrook's only bakery, which had opened early to accommodate the influx of media and law enforcement. Margaret Stevens brought folding chairs for everyone, and soon they formed a small community of observers at the police perimeter. "I keep thinking about that morning," Margaret said, gazing at the bus. Claire and Chloe were so excited for the field trip. They've been talking about the dinosaur exhibit for weeks. Claire wanted to be a paleontologist when she grew up. Her voice wavered slightly. She was going to discover new species and name them after her favorite books. Elena Martinez nodded in agreement. Carlos had never been to a museum before. We couldn't afford those kinds of family trips, so the school field trip was a big deal for him. She added, reminiscing, "He wore his best shirt, a blue-collared one I bought for his school pictures." These were stories they had shared countless times over the decades. But today, they felt different, more immediate, more real. The children were no longer just memories. They were somewhere inside that bus, waiting to be found. Around 9 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to the command post. 2 FBI agents emerged, a man and a woman in their 40s, both with serious expressions in dark suits that seemed to be standard uniform for federal investigators. Detective Torres met them at the perimeter and briefed them on the situation for several minutes. Sarah watched as the agents meticulously surveyed the excavation site, taking photographs and consulting with crime scene technicians. She recognized the professional detachment in their movements, the same emotional distance all investigators had maintained 39 years ago. She understood it was necessary for the job, but she still felt it was wrong. For the families waiting behind the police tape, these were not just evidence and crime scenes. These were their children. Her phone vibrated with a text message. It was Jake Morrison, the foreman. "Sarah, I need to talk to you." "Not here. Too many reporters. Can you meet me at Kowalski's Diner in an hour?" Sarah showed the message to Robert, who agreed to take her place at the vigil. She walked the 3 blocks to the diner, a 1950s-style establishment that had served Millbrook for over 60 years. The morning crowd at the diner was significantly larger than usual, filled with reporters and visiting law enforcement. But Sarah still found Jake in a corner booth. He was nervously twirling a coffee cup in his hands. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, sliding into the seat opposite him. Jake glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "There's something I didn't tell you yesterday. Something I probably should have mentioned right away, but I wasn't sure it was important." "Jake, everything is important now. What did you find?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a tarnished metal object that looked like it had once been a keychain or a small pendant. It was in the dirt about 10 feet from a bus. "I picked it up before I called you to see the bus itself." Sarah took the bag and held it up to the light. The metal was heavily corroded, but she could make out what looked like initials or symbols etched into the surface. "What do you think it is?" "I'm not sure, but look at this." Jake pulled out his phone and showed her a photo he'd taken of the object before bagging it. In the digital image, the markings were much clearer. "Doesn't that look like FD to you?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Frank Delaney." "Jake, you need to give this to Detective Torres immediately. This could be a crucial piece of evidence." "I know. I was going to, but then I started thinking about something else. Something that's been bothering me since yesterday." Jake took a sip of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "My dad worked construction back in the 80s. He did a lot of work for the city and the school district. About 3 months after the bus disappeared, he was hired to do an emergency repair at the school district's bus depot. Foundation issues, they said." "What kind of foundation issues?" Sarah pressed. "That's the weird part. Dad always said it looked more like someone had been digging around the foundation, like they were trying to bury something or move something heavy." Jake continued. "He asked Frank Delaney about it, since Delaney was his contact for the job, but Delaney just said it was settling issues and told him to fix it and not ask questions." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You think your dad suspected something?" "I don't know. He died 5 years ago, so I can't ask him." Jake sighed. "But I remember him talking about that job sometimes, saying it was the strangest repair job he was ever asked to do. The foundation damage was perfectly rectangular, like something big and heavy had been buried there and then dug up again. They sat in silence for a moment. The implications of Jake's revelation settled between them, creating a heavy atmosphere. If Frank Delaney had used school district equipment to initially bury the bus and then moved it to the community fund land, it would explain how he managed to carry out such a massive undertaking unnoticed. Jake, we need to get back to the site immediately. You have to give this evidence to the investigators and tell them about your dad's construction work. As I walked out of the diner, Sarah's phone rang. Detective Torres's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, where are you? We need you here right now. I'm at the diner with Jake Morrison. We're on our way back now. Mike, Jake has something important to tell you. Good, because we have something important to show you too. We managed to clear enough of one of the bus windows to look inside. Sarah's heart stopped. Just get here as fast as you can. Sarah and Jake ran the 3 blocks back to the construction site, pushing through the growing crowd of reporters and onlookers that had swelled throughout the morning. Detective Torres met them at the police perimeter, his expression grim but not hopeless. What did you see? Sarah asked, breathless. Come with me, Torres said, leading them towards the excavation site. But Sarah, I need you to prepare yourself. What we're about to show you will be difficult. They approached the edge of the pit, where the bus sat like a yellow submarine in a sea of dark earth. Crime scene technicians had set up a system of ropes and pulleys so investigators could safely descend into the excavation. One of the bus's side windows had been meticulously cleaned, revealing the dark interior. We've got a light set up inside, Torres explained, handing Sarah a pair of binoculars. Look through window number 3, about halfway back on the driver's side. Sarah raised the binoculars with trembling hands and peered into the cleared window. At first, she saw only shadows and the geometric patterns of the bus seats. Then the light shifted, and she saw them. Small skeletons, still clothed in the remnants of 1980s children's clothing. They sat in the bus seats as if they had simply fallen asleep on a long journey. Some held what looked like school supplies or small toys. They had been preserved by the cold Minnesota earth and the sealed environment of the buried bus. Oh, God, Sarah whispered, lowering the binoculars. They're all still there. They're all still in their seats. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else. A fierce, burning need for justice. Someone had done this to 18 children and their teacher. Someone had buried them alive or killed them and hidden their bodies. Someone had allowed their families to suffer for 39 years without answers. We will find whoever did this, Detective Torres said quietly. I promise you, Sarah, after all these years, we will finally get justice for Emma and all the other children. Sarah nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. The waiting was over. The searching was over. Now came the hardest part, learning the truth about what happened to bus number 47 that spring morning in 1986. The FBI's Mobile Command Center arrived at noon. It was a massive vehicle, equipped with state-of-the-art communication equipment and staffed by a team of highly skilled specialists who handled some of the nation's most complex criminal investigations. Agent Rebecca Shaw, a veteran of the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, took charge of the case with a methodical precision that had made her legendary among her colleagues. Sarah watched from behind the police perimeter as the investigation rapidly escalated from a local missing persons case to a federal criminal inquiry. The entire construction site was now officially designated a crime scene, with multiple zones established for meticulous evidence collection, photography, and witness interviews. The process of extracting the bus from its earthen grave would take days, but initial inspection had already provided crucial information. 18 children and 1 adult. Agent Shaw announced to the assembled investigators during a briefing that Sarah could hear from her position at the perimeter. Preliminary forensics suggest they were likely alive when the bus was buried. This is based on the positioning of the bodies and evidence of attempts to escape. This is now officially a mass homicide investigation. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Alive when they were buried. Emma was alive, trapped in that metal tomb, likely calling for her mother. The thought was almost unbearable, but Sarah forced herself to listen to every detail. She owed Emma that much. Detective Torres approached the family vigil site around 2 in the afternoon, his expression grim. Friends, I need to ask you all some difficult questions about May 15th, 1986. I know we've discussed this before, but with what we've found, every detail could be crucial. He sat among the folding chairs arranged in a rough circle and pulled out his familiar, well-worn notebook. Let's start with the morning routine. Sarah, tell me again about Emma's departure for school that day. Sarah closed her eyes, mentally transporting herself back 39 years to a morning that remained crystal clear in her memory. Emma woke up around 6:30. She was thrilled about the field trip. She'd been talking for weeks about seeing the dinosaur skeletons. She continued, recalling every detail. She wore a favorite dress, a yellow one with flowers. She packed her lunch in the Smurfs lunchbox she got for Christmas. What time did she leave for school? Torres asked. 7:15. The bus picked up kids on our corner at 7:20. But Emma always wanted to get there early. She was afraid of being late. Sarah's voice cracked. She hugged me and said, "See you tonight, Mommy. I'm going to learn about T-Rex." Margaret Stevens spoke up. The twins were the same, so excited. They'd been planning this trip for months, drawing dinosaurs, checking out paleontology books from the library. Detective Torres took notes as each parent shared their memories of that morning. The picture was consistent. Excited children, a normal routine, no indication that anything was amiss. The field trip had been planned for months, widely publicized, and eagerly anticipated by the students. Now, let's talk about Frank Delaney, Torres continued. I know this is difficult, but I need you to think about his behavior in the days and weeks after the disappearance. Did any of you notice anything unusual? Robert Chris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Frank was helpful, almost too helpful. He organized search parties, coordinated with the police, even set up a phone tree to keep all the families updated on the investigation. That doesn't sound suspicious, Elena Martinez said. That sounds like someone who cared about the community. Perhaps, Robert replied. But there was something about his demeanor, like he was performing, like he was trying too hard to appear concerned and helpful. Sarah nodded slowly in agreement. I remember thinking at the time that Frank seemed to know a lot about police procedures and search methods. He was always suggesting new areas to search, new approaches. She added, a realization dawning on her. But now that I think about it, he never suggested searching the area where we found the bus. Agent Shaw emerged from the command post and joined the circle. She was a short woman with streaks of gray in her hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to register every detail of her surroundings. I'm Agent Shaw with the FBI. I've been reviewing the original case files, and I have some questions about the timeline of events on May 15th. She opened a thick folder and pulled out photocopies of pages covered in handwritten notes and typed reports. According to the original investigation, bus number 47 was scheduled to depart Millbrook Elementary at 8 a.m. and arrive at the Natural History Museum in Minneapolis by 9:30 a.m. Agent Shaw continued. Museum staff reported the bus never arrived. The first missing persons report was filed at 11:15 a.m. when the school couldn't reach the driver by radio. That's right, Sarah confirmed. The school called me around 11:30, asking if Emma was sick and stayed home. That's when I knew something was wrong. The bus driver was Harold Zimmerman, 54 years old, 22 years of experience driving school buses. Clean record, no disciplinary actions. He was found 3 days later in his apartment, dead of an apparent heart attack. Agent Shaw looked up from her notes. What struck me as odd was the timing. Zimmerman died sometime between May 16th and 18th, but his body wasn't discovered until the 19th. Detective Torres frowned. Are you suggesting the heart attack wasn't natural? I'm suggesting it's convenient. A bus disappears with 19 people on board, and the driver dies of a heart attack 4 days later. Agent Shaw added with emphasis, in a case this complex, I don't believe in coincidences. Agent Shaw turned to the group of parents. I need to ask you all a difficult question. In the weeks after the disappearance, did any of you receive unusual communications? Phone calls, letters, anything that seemed related to the case? The families exchanged glances. Margaret Stevens hesitantly raised her hand. About 2 weeks after the twins disappeared, I got a call late at night, maybe 11 o'clock. She continued, The person didn't identify themselves, but they said something like, "Your daughters are safe. Don't look for them anymore." "Why didn't you report that to the police?" Torres asked. "I did the next morning. But when I called the station, Frank Delaney answered the phone. He was volunteering to help coordinate the search efforts. Remember, he took my statement and said he'd pass it on to the investigators, but I never heard anything else about it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Margaret, I got a call about 3 weeks after Emma disappeared. The voice was muffled, like they were trying to disguise it, but they said almost the exact same thing. 'Your daughter is safe. Stop looking.' I got a call too," Robert Chris said quietly. "A month after Tommy disappeared. Same message, same muffled voice." Agent Shaw was writing rapidly in her notebook. "How many of you reported these calls to Frank Delaney?" 5 hands went up around the circle. "And how many of you ever received a follow-up from official investigators about those calls?" Not a single hand was raised. The implications were staggering. Frank Delaney had the opportunity to intercept and suppress crucial evidence in the investigation. As the head of the school district transportation department, he had access to bus schedules, routes, and driver information. As a volunteer search coordinator, he was privy to all investigative strategies and could steer searches away from locations where evidence might be found. "There's something else," Agent Shaw continued. "I've been reviewing Frank Delaney's financial records from 1986 and 1987. In June of 1986, just a month after the disappearance, he made a significant cash deposit into his bank account. $25,000, which would be worth about $60,000 today. Where did that money come from?" Sarah asked. "That's what we're trying to find out." Delaney reported it as income from consulting work, but we haven't been able to find any records of what company supposedly hired him or what services he provided. As the day wore on, the excavation of bus number 47 continued. Crime scene specialists worked with painstaking precision, photographing and cataloging every item before it was removed from the burial site. The media presence had swelled to dozens of news vans and hundreds of reporters from across the country. The story had captured national attention. 18 children and their teacher, buried alive 39 years ago. Decades of their family's suffering were finally validated by this horrific discovery. But for Sarah and the other families, the media circus was just background noise. Their focus remained on the bus and the promise of answers that had eluded them for nearly 4 decades. They had waited so long. They could wait a little longer to learn the full truth. As evening fell, Detective Torres received a phone call that changed the direction of the entire investigation. After hanging up, he walked over to Sarah and knelt beside her chair. "Sarah, we found Frank Delaney. He's been living in Phoenix, Arizona, under his own name. The Phoenix Police Department is bringing him in for questioning now." Sarah felt her heart quicken. After 39 years, they were finally going to confront the man who might have killed her daughter. "When will you know what he says?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with anticipation. "Agent Shaw is flying to Phoenix tonight. She'll conduct the interrogation tomorrow morning," Torres added. Looking in her eyes, "Sarah, I want you to know that we will get justice for Emma, for all of them." As she prepared to spend another night on vigil, Sarah looked at the floodlit excavation site, where her daughter's body waited to be brought home. Tomorrow, they might finally get answers. Tomorrow, the man who destroyed so many lives might finally face justice. But tonight, Sarah would continue her vigil, as she had for 39 years, waiting for Emma to finally come home. Agent Shaw's flight to Phoenix departed Minneapolis at 6:30 a.m., carrying with it 39 years of accumulated evidence and the hopes of 19 families. Sarah had stayed awake all night, pacing the perimeter of the excavation site, watching as forensic teams continued their painstaking work under the floodlights. The bus was now fully exposed, its yellow shell scarred and dented but intact, a time capsule holding the most precious cargo imaginable. Detective Torres remained at the command post, coordinating with numerous agencies and fielding calls from reporters, federal investigators, and politicians who suddenly wanted to be associated with the case. The governor announced that the state would spare no expense to bring those responsible to justice. The FBI director personally called to offer additional resources. After decades of bureaucratic indifference, everyone suddenly wanted to help. At 10:15 a.m. Minnesota time, Agent Shaw called from the Phoenix Police Department. Sarah and the other families gathered around Torres's speakerphone in the command trailer. Their faces were taut with anticipation. Frank Delaney is in interrogation room number 3, Shaw reported. He's 78 years old now, uses a walker, but his mind seems sharp. He's agreed to speak with us without an attorney. What's your read on him? Torres asked. Nervous, but cooperative. When we mentioned bus number 47, his face went completely white. He knows why we're here. Sarah squeezed Robert Chris's hand, listening to Shaw's voice coming through the speaker. This was the moment they had all dreamed of and dreaded for nearly 4 decades. I'm going to put the phone on speaker so you can hear the interview in real time, Shaw continued. I know it's not standard procedure, but given the circumstances and the years of family suffering, I think they deserve to hear his explanation firsthand. The audio quality shifted as Shaw activated the speakerphone function on her end. They could hear the ambient noise of the police station, footsteps in the hallways, distant conversations. Then Shaw's voice, professional and composed. Mr. Delaney, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Shaw with the FBI. I want to talk to you about May 15th, 1986, and the disappearance of school bus number 47. A long pause. Then a voice Sarah recognized despite the 39 years that had passed. Frank Delaney, older and more fragile, but unmistakably the same man who had spoken at Emma's memorial service, who had organized search parties, who had comforted grieving families while hiding a terrible truth. I've been waiting for this day for 39 years, Delaney said quietly. I knew you'd find him eventually. I'm actually relieved. Sarah felt tears stream down her face. He was confessing. After all these years, he was finally confessing. Tell me what happened that morning, Frank. Another long pause. The sound of rustling paper. Perhaps a tissue. Then Delaney's voice again, a barely audible whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. You have to believe me. I never wanted those children to die. But they did die, Frank. 18 children and their teacher. Tell me how. Harold Zimmerman was feeling unwell that morning. He called in sick, but we didn't have a spare driver on short notice. The field trip had been planned for months, and the kids were so excited. I made the decision to drive the bus myself. Sarah's hands trembled. Frank Delaney drove the bus. He was there when Emma died. Where did you take them, Frank? Shaw asked, her voice even. To the old quarry outside of town. About 15 miles north of Millbrook, off County Road 47. I told them we were taking a different route to Minneapolis, that I wanted to show them something interesting. Why the quarry, Frank? A longer pause. When Delaney spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. My daughter died there in 1974. Jennifer. She was 7, the same age as some of those kids on the bus. She fell through the ice while ice skating. We never found her body. Sarah closed her eyes, beginning to understand the twisted logic that led to this unthinkable tragedy. I thought if I brought the children there, if I showed them the place where Jennifer died, it would somehow bring her back, Delaney confessed, his voice desperate. I know it sounds crazy now, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I've been drinking that morning, and I was having serious problems at home. My wife was threatening to leave me. Agent Shaw, maintaining her professional composure, asked the next question. What happened at the quarry, Frank? I parked the bus right at the edge, overlooking the water, Delaney continued, his voice filled with agonizing memories. I started telling the children about Jennifer, about how she loved that place, but they got scared. Some of them started crying, asking to go home. Miss Patterson, their teacher, tried to calm them, but she was clearly frightened too. Sarah could vividly imagine the horrifying scene. Emma and her classmates, trapped in a bus with a man clearly in the midst of a profound emotional breakdown, likely terrified and utterly confused by what was happening. What happened next? Shaw asked, prompting him to continue. I don't know exactly. I think I had some kind of seizure or blackout, Delaney mumbled. The next thing I clearly remember, the bus was in the water. It had rolled down the embankment into the quarry. I was outside, soaking wet, and the bus was sinking. Shaw's voice was firm. The children were still alive at that point? Yes, The word escaped his lips like a sob, filled with unbearable pain. I could hear them screaming inside, trying to break the windows. The water was coming in fast, and the bus was sinking to the bottom of the quarry. Nausea washed over Sarah. Emma was alive, trapped in a sinking bus, calling for help, while the man responsible stood on the bank and watched impassively. "What did you do, Frank?" Shaw asked, her voice filled with suppressed condemnation. "I panicked. I knew if anyone found out what happened, I'd go to jail. My career would be over. My family would be ruined. So I made a terrible decision. I decided to hide the bus completely," Delaney confessed. "How?" Shaw asked. "I had keys to all the school district's heavy equipment. That night, I used a crane truck to pull the bus out of the quarry. By then, everyone was dead, drowned." He continued, his voice monotone. "I loaded the bus onto a flatbed trailer and drove it to the community fund lot, where you found it buried. I dug the hole with an excavator and buried the entire bus. It took me most of the night. Then I went home and waited for someone to report the bus missing." Complete silence filled the command trailer, broken only by the sounds of suppressed sobs. 39 years of questions finally had answers. But the truth was far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. "Frank, you participated in the search efforts. You helped coordinate volunteers. You comforted the families. How could you do that, knowing what you had done?" Shaw's voice was filled with righteous anger. "I thought if I helped with the search, if I appeared cooperative, no one would suspect me. And honestly, part of me hoped we'd find them somehow. I kept thinking, maybe I was wrong. Maybe some of them survived. Maybe they escaped," Delaney replied, attempting to justify himself. "But you knew they were dead," Shaw stated firmly. "Yes, I knew they were dead," came his quiet reply. Agent Shaw's voice cut through the static, growing louder and clearer. "Frank Delaney, you are under arrest for 19 counts of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." As Shaw read Delaney his rights, Sarah sank into her chair, emotionally drained. They had a confession. They had answers. Frank Delaney, the man who had pretended to care about their missing children, had been their ruthless killer all along. But even as relief washed over her, Sarah felt a deep, piercing sadness. Emma wasn't coming home. None of the children were coming home. 39 years of hope, searching, and prayers had ended not in a longed-for reunion, but only in confirmation of their worst fears. Detective Torres hung up the phone and turned to the assembled families. "It's over," he simply said, his voice heavy with weariness. "We have answers, and we have justice." Margaret Stevens wiped tears from her eyes. "I don't feel any better. I thought I would, once we finally knew, but I just feel empty." Sarah understood her feelings. The end of hope was its own kind of death, even when that hope was unrealistic. For 39 years, there had always been the possibility, however remote, that Emma would one day walk through the door, older but alive, with stories of where she had been. Now that possibility was gone forever. But as Sarah looked around at the other families, she saw something else in their faces. A sense of peace. After nearly 4 decades of agonizing uncertainty, they finally knew what had happened to their children. Ignorance was its own kind of torture, in some ways worse than the grief itself. "When can we bury them?" Robert Chris asked quietly. "When can we finally lay our children to rest?" "Soon," Torres promised. "The crime scene investigation will take a few more days, but then the coroner will release the remains to the families. You'll finally be able to give them the funerals they deserved 39 years ago." As the families began to disperse, some to make arrangements for long overdue funerals, others to notify relatives who had waited decades for this news, Sarah remained at the excavation site. She needed to see bus number 47 removed from its grave. She needed to be there when Emma was finally brought home. The excavation continued for 2 more days. Forensic teams cataloged every item, every piece of evidence, every heartbreaking remnant of the 19 lives that were lost on May 15, 1986. But the investigation, in essence, was complete. Frank Delaney had confessed to the murders, and justice would finally be served. After 39 years, the mystery of bus number 47 was solved. Now came the hardest part, learning to live with the truth. Frank Delaney's confession was broadcast across all major news channels within hours of its completion. The story dominated social media, sparked countless debates about school safety and background checks, and prompted editorials about the nature of evil hiding in plain sight. But for Sarah and the other families, the media circus felt distant and irrelevant. Their focus remained on the bus and the precious cargo it had concealed for 39 years. The final phase of the excavation began at dawn on the third day. A massive crane was brought in to lift bus number 47 from its earthen grave, a delicate operation requiring precise coordination between multiple agencies. Sarah watched from behind the police tape as forensic teams made final preparations, photographing the bus from all angles, collecting soil samples from around the burial site to ensure no evidence was lost in the extraction process. Detective Torres approached the group of families who had maintained their vigil throughout the investigation. His expression was somber but resolute. "Before we extract the bus, there's something you all need to know," he continued. "The coroner has completed a preliminary examination of the remains and is ready to make some identifications based on dental records and personal effects." Sarah felt her heart quicken. After 39 years, she was finally going to know with certainty that Emma had been found. "We're setting up a private area at the community center where each family can meet individually with the coroner and receive confirmation about their loved ones," Torres added. "I want you to know that this process will be handled with the utmost sensitivity and respect." Margaret Stevens raised her hand. "Will we be able to see them? Will we be able to see our children?" Torres exchanged glances with the FBI agents before responding. "The remains will be prepared by the coroner's office and released to your chosen funeral homes. Given the time elapsed and the circumstances of their burial, viewing may not be advisable. But that decision will ultimately be yours." As the crane operator made final adjustments, Sarah thought about Emma's funeral, the one they should have had 39 years ago, but couldn't because there was no body to bury. She had kept Emma's burial dress in the closet all these years, a size 7 yellow dress with little white flowers that would have matched Emma's favorite outfit. Now, finally, she would be able to use it. The lifting operation began at 10:30 a.m. The crane's cables were attached to specially designed slings that distributed the bus's weight evenly, preventing any damage to the vehicle or its contents. As the bus slowly rose from its grave, decades of soil crumbled away like shed skin, revealing the full extent of the vehicle that had become a tomb. Sarah held her breath as bus number 47 emerged completely from the earth. The yellow paint was faded and covered in rust and mineral deposits, but the overall structure was remarkably intact. The windows were opaque with dirt and corrosion, but she could make out the shadows within. The silhouettes of seats and smaller forms that she forced herself not to examine too closely. The bus was loaded onto a specially prepared trailer for transport to the State Forensic Laboratory, where the final phase of the investigation would take place. Every seat, every remnant, every personal item would be cataloged and examined. The children's belongings, lunchboxes, backpacks, toys, and books would be cleaned and returned to their families once the investigation was complete. As the trailer carrying bus number 47 disappeared down the highway toward Minneapolis, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Emma had finally been found, grief that was breathtaking as the reality of her daughter's death crashed over her again, and anger, a burning righteous fury at Frank Delaney for what he had done and for the 39 years of lies that followed. Detective Torres was in constant contact with the Phoenix Police Department, tracking Delaney's processing through the Arizona criminal justice system. Official extradition papers have been filed, and Delaney would be transferred to Minnesota within a week to face murder charges. "I want to see him," Sarah told Torres as they walked back to the command trailer. "When he gets here, I want to see him face to face." "Sarah, I understand the impulse, but I'm not sure that's a good idea. Victim impact statements will be part of the sentencing phase if he's convicted. So you'll have an opportunity to address him in court," Torres explained. "It's not the same. I want to look him in the eye and ask him why. Why Emma? Why any of them? What could possibly justify what he did?" Torres nodded slowly, understanding her pain. I'll see what I can arrange. But Sarah, you need to prepare yourself that his answers may not satisfy you. People who do things like this often don't have reasons that make sense to anyone else. The community center had been quickly converted into a temporary morgue and identification center. One by one, families were called in to meet with the coroner and receive official confirmation about their children. Sarah was the third family called, and she walked into the sterile room with trembling hands and a pounding heart. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the county coroner, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, obviously honed over years of delivering devastating news to families. She gestured for Sarah to sit across from her at a small table covered with official documents and evidence bags. Mrs. Chung, I have completed the examination of the remains found in seat number 7 of the bus, Dr. Morrison began, her voice calm and compassionate. Based on dental records provided by your family dentist and personal effects found with the remains, I can confirm that your daughter, Emma, was among the children recovered from bus number 47. Sarah had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it, but the official confirmation still hit her like a physical blow. Emma was dead, had been dead for 39 years. All the hopes, searches, and prayers had been in vain. How did she die? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Morrison, her expression remaining compassionate but professional, replied, based on my examination, Emma and the other children died of drowning when the bus plunged into the quarry. The remains show no signs of physical trauma or violence. It appears they were unconscious or in a state of panic as the water filled the bus. Sarah asked the next, most agonizing question. Did she suffer? I believe the children lost consciousness quickly as the bus filled with water. While I cannot say with certainty that there was no suffering, the evidence suggests their deaths were relatively swift. Dr. Morrison opened one of the evidence bags and carefully removed a small item. This was found with Emma's remains. I believe it belonged to her. Sarah looked at the item, and her world tilted. It was Emma's most prized possession, a small silver locket that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken at Emma's 6th birthday party. The locket was tarnished and corroded, but the photograph was still recognizable. She wore it that morning, Sarah said, taking the locket with trembling hands. She always wore it on special days. She said it brought her good luck. As Sarah left the identification center, she felt as if she were walking in a dream. The locket was clutched tightly in her hand. Its weight was both comforting and heartbreaking. Now she had concrete proof that Emma was gone, but she also had something she could hold, something that connected her to the daughter she had lost. Other families emerged from their meetings with similar expressions of grief, mixed with relief. Margaret Stevens was sobbing, clutching what looked like a small bracelet. Robert Chris carried a baseball card that had belonged to his son, Tommy. Each family received some small memento, some physical proof of their lost children. Evening was approaching. The families gathered one last time at the construction site, where bus number 47 had been buried. The excavation was complete, the equipment removed, but the pit remained, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had been hidden beneath their feet for nearly 4 decades. Sheriff Rodriguez joined them as they stood around the empty grave. I want you all to know that the investigation into this case is now complete. Frank Delaney has been charged with 19 counts of first-degree murder, and the evidence against him is irrefutable. Justice will be served. When's the trial? Elena Martinez asked. That will depend on whether Delaney decides to plead guilty or contest the charges. Given his confession and the physical evidence, I suspect his attorney will advise him to negotiate a plea deal. But regardless of how that plays out legally, this case is closed. You can finally begin to heal. As the families began to disperse, making arrangements for funerals that had been delayed for 39 years, Sarah remained by the empty grave. Detective Torres approached her as the sun set behind the trees bordering the construction site. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm not," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I'd feel different once we finally found Emma. I thought there'd be some sense of closure, a feeling that this chapter of my life was finally over. But I just feel empty." "That's normal, Sarah. You've lived with this loss for 39 years. It's going to take time to process what we've learned and figure out how to move forward. Sarah nodded, still gazing into the empty grave. I keep thinking about all the years I spent looking for her. All the hope I held on to that she might still be alive somewhere. It feels like I wasted so much time on a pipe dream. You didn't waste anything, Torres said firmly. Your love for Emma, your refusal to give up, that's what led to this discovery. If you hadn't been there when the construction crew found the bus, if you hadn't recognized it immediately for what it was, this case might have remained unsolved for another 39 years. As they walked away from the construction site together, Sarah felt the weight of the locket in her pocket. Emma was gone, had been gone longer than she had been alive. But Sarah was still here, and she had a job to do. There was a funeral to plan, a trial to attend, and a life to somehow build that honored Emma's memory while acknowledging the reality of her death. The mystery of bus number 47 was solved. But Sarah's journey was just beginning. After 39 years of searching for her daughter, she now had to learn how to say goodbye. Frank Delaney arrived in Minnesota on a gray November morning. He was transported from Phoenix in shackles, wearing the orange jumpsuit that would become his uniform for the rest of his life. Sarah was among a small group of family members gathered outside the Hennepin County Courthouse to witness his first appearance before a Minnesota judge. After 39 years, they would finally see the man who had shattered their lives facing the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members who had traveled from across the country for this moment. Sarah sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, with Margaret Stevens on one side and Robert Chris on the other. They had become a kind of surrogate family, bound by shared tragedy and a long journey toward justice. When Delaney was led into the courtroom, Sarah was shocked by his appearance. The man she remembered from 1986 was in his 30s, tall and confident, someone who commanded respect in the community. The man she saw now was a frail, elderly figure who shuffled with the aid of a walker. His hair was completely white, and his face was deeply etched with the lines of age and, she hoped, guilt. But as Delaney turned to survey the courtroom, Sarah saw that his eyes were still sharp and alert. This was not a broken man consumed by remorse. This was someone who had lived with his secret for nearly 4 decades and managed to build a new life in Arizona, far from the scene of his crimes. Judge Patricia Kowalski, no relation to Martha Kowalski, who served on the Community Fund Board in 1986, called the session to order. The charges were read: 19 counts of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other related felonies. Each charge carried a potential penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Delaney's attorney, a public defender named James Mitchell, who looked barely old enough to be out of law school, entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. This decision surprised everyone in the courtroom, including the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, who had been preparing for a guilty plea and immediate sentencing. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, rising from his chair with a clear nervousness, "my client wishes to exercise his constitutional right to a jury trial. While he has made certain statements to law enforcement, he maintains his innocence regarding the first-degree murder charges." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had assumed Delaney's confession would lead to a swift resolution. The thought of a lengthy trial, with its inevitable media circus and painful testimony, was almost unbearable. Judge Kowalski set a trial date for the following March, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. As Delaney was led out of the courtroom, he turned once more to look at the families in the gallery. His eyes met Sarah's for a moment, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. Not remorse or guilt, but a cold calculation, as if he were measuring her resolve. Outside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Morrison briefed the families on what to expect in the coming months. "I want you to understand that this trial will be difficult for everyone involved. The defense will likely argue that my client's confession was coerced or that he was suffering from diminished capacity due to his age. They may also challenge the physical evidence, arguing that 39 years in the ground could have compromised its integrity. But he confessed," Margaret Stevens cried out, her voice filled with indignation. We all heard him confess, and that confession will be a crucial part of our case, Morrison replied, remaining calm. Defense attorneys are paid to create reasonable doubt, and they will use every means at their disposal to do so. I need you all to be prepared for the fact that this trial could take months, and some of the testimony will be very difficult to hear. As winter wrapped Minnesota in its cold embrace, Sarah immersed herself fully in preparing for Emma's funeral. The coroner had released Emma's remains a week before Thanksgiving, and Sarah chose a small funeral home in Millbrook that had been in operation since the 1950s. The funeral director, a kind man named William Chun, who happened to share Sarah's last name though they were not related, had considerable experience with complex cases and understood the unique difficulties of burying a child who had been missing for nearly 4 decades. The service was held on a snowy December morning at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, the same church where Emma had attended Sunday school and where Sarah had prayed countless times for her daughter's safe return. The small church was filled to capacity with friends, relatives, and community members who had never stopped hoping Emma would come home. Sarah chose to display photographs of Emma throughout the church, rather than having an open casket. Pictures from Emma's short life lined the altar. Emma as a baby taking her first steps. Emma walking into kindergarten with her gap-toothed smile. Emma playing dress-up in Sarah's clothes. Emma blowing out the candles on her 7th birthday cake, just 2 months before she disappeared. Pastor David Matthews, who had comforted Sarah through the darkest years of her grief, delivered a eulogy that managed to be both heartbreaking and hopeful. He spoke of Emma's love for animals, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her kindness to other children, and her unwavering belief that everything would be okay. Emma lived her 7 years more fully than many people live 70, Pastor Matthews said. She met each day with wonder and joy, and she touched everyone who knew her with her enthusiasm for life. While we mourn the years that were stolen from her, we can also celebrate the gift of knowing such a special child. Sarah had written her own eulogy for Emma, but when it came time to deliver it, she found she couldn't speak. The words she had rehearsed for weeks vanished, replaced by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. Robert Chris stepped forward and gently took the paper from her hands, reading Sarah's words in a voice that carried across the hushed church. My Emma was sunshine in human form. She woke up every morning full of anticipation for the possibilities the day might bring. She believed in magic, in fairy tales, and in happy endings. She thought all dogs were friendly and all people were kind. Her favorite question was, why? And she never stopped asking it. Never stopped wanting to understand how the world worked. I know that wherever Emma is now, she's still asking questions, still learning, still spreading joy to everyone around her. I love you, baby girl. Mommy will see you again someday. The burial took place at Millbrook Cemetery, in a plot Sarah had purchased 39 years ago, when hope was still stronger than despair. Emma's small white casket was lowered into the frozen ground as snow began to fall. Each snowflake looked like a tiny star against the gray November sky. As the mourners began to disperse, Sarah remained at the graveside, looking at the casket that contained what was left of her daughter. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Detective Torres, who had driven from Minneapolis for the service. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I'd feel better after the funeral, like Emma could finally rest in peace. But I just feel angry. Angry that it took 39 years. Angry that Frank Delaney got to live a whole life, and Emma didn't get to grow up. That anger is normal, Sarah, and it's probably what will get you through the trial. You're going to need that strength in the coming months." As they walked back to their cars, Torres shared an update on the case's preparation. The prosecution team has been working around the clock to build an airtight case. They found additional evidence corroborating Delaney's confession, including soil samples from his property that matched the dirt found on the bus. They've also uncovered financial records that show he made several large cash purchases in the months after the murders, likely trying to dispose of the money he mentioned in his confession. What about his defense? What are they claiming? Sarah asked. They plan to argue that Delaney was suffering from a mental breakdown in 1986 and that the murders were not premeditated. They want to get the charges reduced from first-degree murder to manslaughter, which would carry a much lighter sentence. Sarah felt her anger flare. He buried a bus full of children and then lied about it for 39 years. How is that not premeditated? I completely agree. But that's the game defense attorneys play. They'll try to paint Delaney as a victim of his own mental illness. A man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of crisis and then compounded it out of fear and shame. As Sarah drove home from the cemetery, she thought about the months ahead. The trial would be a marathon, not a sprint. There would be weeks of testimony, expert witnesses, legal motions, and media coverage. She would have to relive the worst day of her life over and over again in front of strangers who would dissect every detail of Emma's disappearance. But Sarah was ready for the fight. She had waited 39 years for justice, and she wasn't about to let Frank Delaney escape accountability for what he had done. Emma deserved better than a reduced charge and a lighter sentence. All 18 children deserve better. The trial was months away, but the battle for justice had already begun, and Sarah intended to win. March arrived in Minnesota with the slow, reluctant promise of spring. But inside the Hennepin County Courthouse, the atmosphere remained as cold and gray as the winter that was finally ending. Frank Delaney's trial had drawn national attention, with major network reporters setting up equipment in the courthouse lobby and legal experts commenting on every procedural development. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her job as county building inspector to attend every day of the trial. She sat in the same seat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Margaret Stevens and Robert Criss. The three of them had become unofficial representatives for all the families affected by the Bus Number 47 tragedy. Jury selection took 2 weeks, with both sides meticulously vetting potential jurors for any prior knowledge of the case or bias against crimes involving children. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68, representing a cross-section of Minnesota society who would ultimately decide Frank Delaney's fate. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison began the prosecution's case with a methodical presentation of the timeline of events on May 15, 1986. Using a large screen, she showed the jury photographs of each of the 18 children and their teacher, Miss Patterson, making them real people, not abstract victims. Now she had concrete proof that Emma was gone, but she also had something she could hold, something that connected her to the daughter she had lost. Other families emerged from their meetings with similar expressions of grief mixed with relief. Margaret Stevens was sobbing, clutching what looked like a small bracelet. Robert Criss carried a baseball card that had belonged to his son, Tommy. Each family received some small memento, some physical proof of their lost children. Evening was approaching. The families gathered one last time at the construction site where Bus Number 47 had been buried. The excavation was complete, the equipment removed, but the pit remained, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had been hidden beneath their feet for nearly 4 decades. Sheriff Rodriguez joined them as they stood around the empty grave. I want you all to know that the investigation into this case is now complete. Frank Delaney has been charged with 19 counts of first-degree murder, and the evidence against him is irrefutable. Justice will be served. When's the trial? Elena Martinez asked. That will depend on whether Delaney decides to plead guilty or contest the charges. Given his confession and the physical evidence, I suspect his attorney will advise him to negotiate a plea deal. But regardless of how that plays out legally, this case is closed. You can finally begin to heal. As the families began to disperse, planning funerals that had been delayed for 39 years, Sarah remained by the empty grave. Detective Torres approached her as the sun set behind the trees bordering the construction site. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Not well," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I'd feel different once we finally found Emma. I thought there'd be some sense of closure, a feeling that this chapter of my life was finally over. But I just feel empty." "That's normal, Sarah. You've lived with this loss for 39 years. It's going to take time to process what we've learned and figure out how to move forward." Sarah nodded, still gazing into the empty grave. I keep thinking about all the years I spent looking for her, all the hope I held on to that she might still be alive somewhere. It feels like I wasted so much time on a pipe dream. You didn't waste anything, Torres said firmly. Your love for Emma, your refusal to give up, that's what led to this discovery. If you hadn't been there when the construction crew found the bus, if you hadn't recognized it immediately for what it was, this case might have remained unsolved for another 39 years. As they walked away from the construction site together, Sarah felt the weight of the locket in her pocket. Emma was gone, had been gone longer than she had been alive. But Sarah was still here, and she had a job to do. There was a funeral to plan, a trial to attend, and a life to somehow build that honored Emma's memory while acknowledging the reality of her death. The mystery of bus number 47 was solved, but Sarah's journey was just beginning. After 39 years of searching for her daughter, she now had to learn how to say goodbye. Frank Delaney arrived in Minnesota on a gray November morning. He was transported from Phoenix in shackles, wearing the orange jumpsuit that would become his uniform for the rest of his life. Sarah was among a small group of family members gathered outside the Hennepin County Courthouse to witness his first appearance before a Minnesota judge. After 39 years, they would finally see the man who had shattered their lives facing the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members who had traveled from across the country for this moment. Sarah sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, with Margaret Stevens on one side and Robert Criss on the other. They had become a kind of surrogate family, bound by shared tragedy and a long journey toward justice. When Delaney was led into the courtroom, Sarah was shocked by his appearance. The man she remembered from 1986 was in his 30s, tall and confident, someone who commanded respect in the community. The man she saw now was a frail, elderly figure who shuffled with the aid of a walker. His hair was completely white, and his face was deeply etched with the lines of age and, she hoped, guilt. But as Delaney turned to survey the courtroom, Sarah saw that his eyes were still sharp and alert. This was not a broken man consumed by remorse. This was someone who had lived with a secret for almost 4 decades and managed to build a new life in Arizona, far from the scene of his crimes. Judge Patricia Kowalski, no relation to Martha Kowalski, who served on the Community Fund Board in 1986, called the session to order. The charges were read: 19 counts of first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other related felonies. Each charge carried a potential penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Delaney's attorney, a public defender named James Mitchell, who looked barely old enough to be out of law school, entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. This decision surprised everyone in the courtroom, including the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, who had been preparing for a guilty plea and immediate sentencing. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, rising from his chair with a clear nervousness, "my client wishes to exercise his constitutional right to a jury trial. While he has made certain statements to law enforcement, he maintains his innocence regarding the first-degree murder charges." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had assumed Delaney's confession would lead to a swift resolution. The thought of a lengthy trial, with its inevitable media circus and painful testimony, was almost unbearable. Judge Kowalski set a trial date for the following March, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. As Delaney was led out of the courtroom, he turned once more to look at the families in the gallery. His eyes met Sarah's for a moment, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. Not remorse or guilt, but a cold calculation, as if he were measuring her resolve. Outside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Morrison briefed the families on what to expect in the coming months. "I want you to understand that this trial will be difficult for everyone involved. The defense will likely argue that my client's confession was coerced or that he was suffering from diminished capacity due to his age. They may also challenge the physical evidence, arguing that 39 years in the ground could have compromised its integrity. But he confessed." Margaret Stevens cried out, her voice filled with indignation. "We all heard him confess, and that confession will be a crucial part of our case," Morrison replied. remaining calm. Defense attorneys are paid to create reasonable doubt, and they will use every means at their disposal to do so. I need you all to be prepared for the fact that this trial could take months, and that some of the testimony will be very difficult to hear. As winter wrapped Minnesota in its cold embrace, Sarah immersed herself fully in preparing for Emma's funeral. The coroner had released Emma's remains a week before Thanksgiving, and Sarah chose a small funeral home in Millbrook that had been in operation since the 1950s. The funeral director, a kind man named William Chun, who happened to share Sarah's last name though they were not related, had considerable experience with complex cases and understood the unique difficulties of burying a child who had been missing for nearly 4 decades. The service was held on a snowy December morning at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, the same church where Emma had attended Sunday school and where Sarah had prayed countless times for her daughter's safe return. The small church was filled to capacity with friends, relatives, and community members who had never stopped hoping Emma would come home. Sarah chose to display photographs of Emma throughout the church, rather than having an open casket. Pictures from Emma's short life lined the altar. Emma as a baby taking her first steps. Emma walking into kindergarten with her gap-toothed smile. Emma playing dress-up in Sarah's clothes. Emma blowing out the candles on her 7th birthday cake, just 2 months before she disappeared. Pastor David Matthews, who had comforted Sarah through the darkest years of her grief, delivered a eulogy that managed to be both heartbreaking and hopeful. He spoke of Emma's love for animals, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her kindness to other children, and her unwavering belief that everything would be okay. Emma lived her 7 years more fully than many people live 70, Pastor Matthews said. She met each day with wonder and joy, and she touched everyone who knew her with her enthusiasm for life. While we mourn the years that were stolen from her, we can also celebrate the gift of knowing such a special child. Sarah had written her own eulogy for Emma, but when it came time to deliver it, she found she couldn't speak. The words she had rehearsed for weeks vanished, replaced by a grief so profound it felt like drowning. Robert Chris stepped forward and gently took the paper from her hands, reading Sarah's words in a voice that carried across the hushed church. My Emma was sunshine in human form. She woke up every morning full of anticipation for the possibilities the day might bring. She believed in magic, in fairy tales, and in happy endings. She thought all dogs were friendly and all people were kind. Her favorite question was, why? And she never stopped asking it. Never stopped wanting to understand how the world worked. I know that wherever Emma is now, she's still asking questions, still learning, still spreading joy to everyone around her. I love you, baby girl. Mommy will see you again someday. The burial took place at Millbrook Cemetery, in a plot Sarah had purchased 39 years ago, when hope was still stronger than despair. Emma's small white casket was lowered into the frozen ground as snow began to fall. Each snowflake looked like a tiny star against the gray November sky. As the mourners began to disperse, Sarah remained at the graveside, looking at the casket that contained what was left of her daughter. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Detective Torres, who had driven from Minneapolis for the service. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I'd feel better after the funeral, like Emma could finally rest in peace. But I just feel angry. Angry that it took 39 years. Angry that Frank Delaney got to live a whole life, and Emma didn't get to grow up. That anger is normal, Sarah, and it's probably what will get you through the trial. You're going to need that strength in the coming months." As they walked back to their cars, Torres shared an update on the case's preparation. The prosecution team has been working around the clock to build an airtight case. They found additional evidence corroborating Delaney's confession, including soil samples from his property that matched the dirt found on the bus. They've also uncovered financial records that show he made several large cash purchases in the months after the murders, likely trying to dispose of the money he mentioned in his confession. What about his defense? What are they claiming? Sarah asked. They plan to argue that Delaney was suffering from a mental breakdown in 1986 and that the murders were not premeditated. They want to get the charges reduced from first-degree murder to manslaughter, which would carry a much lighter sentence. Sarah felt her anger flare. He buried a bus full of children and then lied about it for 39 years. How is that not premeditated? I completely agree. But that's the game defense attorneys play. They'll try to paint Delaney as a victim of his own mental illness. A man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of crisis and then compounded it out of fear and shame. As Sarah drove home from the cemetery, she thought about the months ahead. The trial would be a marathon, not a sprint. There would be weeks of testimony, expert witnesses, legal motions, and media coverage. She would have to relive the worst day of her life over and over again in front of strangers who would dissect every detail of Emma's disappearance. But Sarah was ready for the fight. She had waited 39 years for justice, and she wasn't about to let Frank Delaney escape accountability for what he had done. Emma deserved better than a reduced charge and a lighter sentence. All 18 children deserved better. The trial was months away, but the battle for justice had already begun, and Sarah intended to win. March arrived in Minnesota with the slow, reluctant promise of spring. But inside the Hennepin County Courthouse, the atmosphere remained as cold and gray as the winter that was finally ending. Frank Delaney's trial had drawn national attention, with major network reporters setting up equipment in the courthouse lobby and legal experts commenting on every procedural development. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her job as county building inspector to attend every day of the trial. She sat in the same seat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Margaret Stevens and Robert Criss. The three of them had become unofficial representatives for all the families affected by the Bus Number 47 tragedy. Jury selection took 2 weeks, with both sides meticulously vetting potential jurors for any prior knowledge of the case or bias against crimes involving children. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 68, representing a cross-section of Minnesota society who would ultimately decide Frank Delaney's fate. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison began the prosecution's case with a methodical presentation of the timeline of events on May 15, 1986. Using a large screen, she showed the jury photographs of each of the 18 children and their teacher, Miss Patterson, making them real people, not abstract victims. 19 small trees had been planted in memory of the victims, each with a plaque bearing the child's name, birth date, and date of death. Emma's tree was a young maple, which would grow tall over time and provide shade for future generations of Millbrook children. Sarah paused at the memorial on her way home from the courthouse, needing a few minutes of quiet reflection before facing the inevitable phone calls and visits from well-meaning friends and relatives. She sat on a bench installed beneath Emma's tree and tried to imagine what her daughter would look like now, at 46. Would she have children of her own? Would she have become the veterinarian she dreamed of being? These were questions that would never be answered, dreams that would never come true. Frank Delaney had stolen not only Emma's life, but all the possibilities that life might have held. The conviction and life sentence were justice, but they couldn't bring back what was lost. "I thought I'd find you here," a voice said. Behind her, Sarah turned to see Margaret Stevens approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the convenience store across the street. Margaret looked exhausted, but at peace, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "How are you holding up?" Margaret asked, settling onto the bench beside Sarah. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I'd feel different once it was all over. I thought there'd be some sense of closure, some feeling that we could finally move on, but I mostly just feel empty." Margaret nodded, understanding. "I know what you mean. For 39 years, finding out what happened to our children was the most important thing in our lives. It gave us purpose, kept us going, even when everything else felt hopeless. Now that we have answers, now that justice has been served, what do we do with ourselves?" It was a question all the families were grappling with. Robert Criss had mentioned during the trial that he was considering writing a book about the experience, both as a way to process his grief and to ensure the story of the 18 children was told accurately. Elena Martinez was working with a national organization that assisted families of missing children, using her experience to support other parents facing similar tragedies. "I keep thinking about all the time I wasted," Sarah said. 39 years of hoping Emma was still alive, following false leads and chasing shadows. I could have been living, truly living, instead of just existing in a state of suspended animation. You didn't waste anything, Margaret said firmly. Your refusal to give up. Your determination to keep looking for answers. That's what led to the discovery of bus number 47. If you had given up years ago, if you had moved on like everyone told us to, those children might still be buried in that pit, and Frank Delaney would still be playing golf in Arizona. Sarah knew Margaret was right intellectually, but emotionally, she still struggled with the feeling that she had squandered decades of her life. She was 54 years old, had never remarried, had no other children, and had built her entire identity around being Emma's mother and her seeker. Now, she had to figure out who she was when that role was no longer needed. The next few weeks brought a steady stream of visitors to Sarah's home. Reporters wanting follow-up interviews, true crime authors researching books about the case, documentary filmmakers seeking access to family photos and personal stories. Sarah turned down most of them, but she agreed to participate in a memorial documentary being produced by Minnesota Public Television, feeling it would be a dignified tribute to Emma and the other victims. The documentary crew interviewed Sarah in Emma's bedroom, which she had preserved exactly as it was on the day Emma disappeared. The producer, a thoughtful woman named Jennifer Walsh, asked Sarah to talk about her daughter's personality, her dreams, her impact on the people who knew her. Emma was pure joy, Sarah said, holding one of Emma's stuffed animals. She approached every day with wonder and enthusiasm. She believed that people were mostly good, that problems could be solved, that happy endings were possible. Even at 7, she had this incredible optimism that made everyone around her feel better about the world. What do you want people to remember about Emma? Jennifer asked. Sarah thought for a long moment before answering. I want them to remember that she was more than just a victim. She was a whole person with hopes and dreams and a future that was stolen from her. She loved horses, strawberry ice cream, and bedtime stories. She wanted to help sick animals and make the world a better place. She was my daughter, but she was also her own person, and she deserved to grow up and live her life. The documentary aired 6 months after the trial concluded, on the 40th anniversary of the disappearance. Sarah watched it at home with Margaret and Robert. The three of them sat together in Sarah's living room, sharing memories and tears as their children's stories were told with dignity and respect. The program concluded with recent footage of the memorial park, showing visitors leaving flowers and small toys at the base of the 19 trees. Children from Millbrook Elementary, some of them the same age Emma was when she died, had made drawings and cards that were displayed on a bulletin board at the memorial's entrance. "Look at that," Margaret said, pointing to one of the drawings on the screen. It depicted a school bus with wings, flying through clouds towards a bright sun. Below it, in neat child's handwriting, were the words, "To the kids of bus number 47, you are not forgotten." In time, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She put her Millbrook home up for sale and began making plans to move to Colorado, where her sister lived. She had been offered a position with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to families of missing persons, and she decided to accept the offer. "I need to do something with everything I've learned," Sarah explained to Detective Torres when she called to tell him of her decision. 39 years of navigating the system, the emotions, the process of searching, waiting, and hoping. Maybe I can use that to help other families. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Torres replied. "You have a unique perspective that could be incredibly valuable to other parents going through what you experienced." Sarah's last day in Millbrook was bittersweet. She visited Emma's grave one last time, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly by the headstone for over an hour. She had decided to have Emma's remains moved to Colorado eventually, so they could be together. But for now, Emma would rest in the town where she was born and raised. "I'm not abandoning you," Sarah said aloud, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "I'm just trying to figure out how to live again, how to make something good come out of all this pain." She added, her voice full of tenderness, "I love you, baby girl. I'll always love you." As Sarah drove out of Millbrook for the last time, she passed the memorial park where bus number 47 had been discovered. A group of children were playing near the trees, their laughter mingling with the sound of the wind and the leaves. It was a sound Emma would have loved, Sarah thought. The sound of childhood joy, of possibility, of hope for the future. The mystery of bus number 47 had been solved. Justice had been served. And now, for Sarah, it was time to begin the next chapter of her life. She would always carry Emma's memory, but she would no longer be defined by loss. Instead, she would be defined by love, by resilience, and by a determination to help other families find the answers they needed to heal. The road ahead stretched before her, leading towards mountains and new beginnings. Sarah drove towards her future, carrying her daughter's love in her heart and her story on her lips, ready to help other parents navigate the darkest path they would ever have to walk. Emma was gone, but her legacy would live on in every family Sarah helped, in every case she touched, in every parent she comforted with wisdom forged from enduring the unimaginable. The end of one story was the beginning of another, and Sarah was finally ready to write the next chapter. 5 years after Frank Delaney's conviction, Sarah stood in a conference room at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Alexandria, Virginia, looking out at 25 law enforcement officers who had traveled from across the country for specialized cold case training. She had been invited to speak about the bus number 47 case as a prime example of how persistence and new technology could unravel even the oldest and seemingly most hopeless mysteries. The key to solving cold cases, Sarah lectured the assembled investigators, her voice confident and resonant, is not just about applying advanced forensics or having access to vast new databases. The true unlock lies in deeply understanding that behind every yellowed file folder, every dusty evidence box, every faded photograph, there's a living family who has never given up hope for answers to their agonizing questions. Sarah had been working at the organization in Colorado for 5 years, and her reputation as a tireless advocate for families and an expert consultant on cold cases had exceeded her wildest expectations. In that time, she had helped locate 12 missing persons, contributed to the prosecution of 6 perpetrators, and provided invaluable support to hundreds of families navigating the nightmare of a loved one's disappearance without a trace. This work, while emotionally draining, filled Sarah's life with a profound sense of purpose that was inextricably linked to Emma's memory. Every family she reached out to, every case she became involved in, every small victory in the fight against those who harmed children became a tribute to the 7-year-old girl who genuinely wanted to make the world a better place. A detective in the audience, a woman named Mrs. Chan, raised her hand. What advice would you give to families facing similar tragic situations? How do they maintain hope while also protecting themselves from false leads and the inevitable disappointments? Sarah considered the question deeply. It was one she heard often, and her answer had evolved over the years as she worked with more and more families and gained a new, broader perspective on her own journey. Hope and realism are not mutually exclusive concepts, she stated. You must hope, because hope is the driving force that allows you to function, that motivates you to keep looking for answers. However, you must also live your life. You cannot put everything on hold indefinitely, waiting for news that may never come. She mentally flashed back to her own experience, to the decade she spent in a state of emotional, suspended animation, unable to move forward because she couldn't let go of the faint possibility that Emma was still alive. If I could go back to 1986 and talk to myself, I would tell that devastated mother to keep searching, to keep advocating, to keep pushing for answers. But I would also tell her to seek help, to maintain friendships, to find ways to honor her daughter's memory while still living her own life. After the presentation, Sarah took a leisurely walk through downtown Alexandria, a city she had come to know well through her frequent visits to the National Center. It was a beautiful October day, the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold, and Sarah found herself thinking of Emma and what she would look like now, at 51. Her phone vibrated with a text message from Margaret Stevens, who had become one of her closest friends in the years since the trial. Margaret had moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren, but maintained regular contact with Sarah and the other families affected by the bus number 47 tragedy. Watching your presentation online, Margaret texted, "So proud of how you've turned your pain into purpose. Emma will be proud too." That evening, Sarah returned to her hotel room and called Robert Chris, who had indeed written a book about the bus number 47 case. The long search, subtitled A Father's Journey Through 39 Years of Questions, had been published 2 years prior and become a bestseller, with Robert donating all proceeds to organizations supporting families of missing children. "How was the presentation?" Robert asked. "Good. I think the audience was engaged, asked thoughtful questions." Sarah continued. "There was one detective from Oregon who has a 1992 cold case that sounds similar in some aspects to our situation. I'm going to make some calls, see if I can help them connect with the right resources." This was typical of Sarah's approach to her work. She had become a kind of connector, using her vast network of contacts in law enforcement, forensics, and victim advocacy to help solve cases and provide support to families. She wasn't a detective herself in the traditional sense, but she understood the system better than almost anyone and knew how to navigate its complexities. "Have you heard anything from Elena lately?" Robert asked. Elena Martinez had become a prominent advocate for missing children's rights, testifying before Congress and working with the FBI to improve protocol for child abduction responses. She called last week. She's working with a senator from Texas on a bill that would mandate shorter response times for Amber Alerts. She thinks they have enough support to get it passed next year. It was remarkable how the tragedy of bus number 47 had motivated all the families to channel their grief into action. Instead of being consumed by bitterness or despair, each of them had found ways to use their painful experience to help others and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The next morning, Sarah flew back to Denver, where she had built a new life that balanced her advocacy work with personal relationships and interests she had neglected for decades. She had a small apartment in a converted Victorian house with a garden where she grew vegetables that Emma had always wanted to help plant. She joined a book club, learned to paint watercolors, and even started dating a kind man named David, a retired teacher who was understanding of her need to honor her daughter's memory, while also living in the present. As her plane descended towards Denver International Airport, Sarah looked out the window at the majestic Rocky Mountains, towering over the plains like ancient, unyielding promises. Colorado had given her a new perspective, both literally and figuratively. The mountains reminded her that some things are constant, enduring, while others are temporary and fleeting. Her phone rang as she collected her luggage. Detective Torres, now retired but still actively involved in cold cases as a consultant, was calling with news about a case she had been tracking in Wisconsin. "Sarah, you're going to want to sit down," Torres said, his voice filled with anticipation. "Remember the Paulson family in Wisconsin? The 8-year-old girl who disappeared from a church picnic in 1998. Of course, Jenny Paulson, last seen playing near the parking lot while her parents helped clean up. Never found any trace," Sarah replied. "Well, they just arrested the church groundskeeper, a man named William Morrison. Turns out he's been living under an assumed name for 25 years. His real name is William Brennan, and he's Harold Brennan's son." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Harold Brennan was the president of the Millbrook Community Fund in 1986, the organization that owned the land where bus number 47 was buried. He had died of natural causes in 1994, but not before, apparently, passing on his criminal tendencies to his son. "My God, Mike, are you saying this is connected to our case?" "Potentially. Morrison Brennan has worked at churches in 4 different states over the last 25 years, and we're finding that children have gone missing in the communities where he worked. It looks like we may have uncovered a serial predator who learned his methods by watching his father." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar mix of anger and determination that had sustained her throughout the bus number 47 investigation. Even now, 8 years after Delaney's conviction, the case continued to yield new horrors and new opportunities for justice. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked, her voice firm. "Your expertise in family liaison. We have 6 families across 4 states who are about to learn that their children's disappearances may finally be solved. They're going to need someone who understands what they've been through. Sarah didn't hesitate for a second. I'll be on the next flight to Wisconsin. As she rebooked her flights and prepared to dive into a new investigation, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. Since that gray October morning in 2025, when Jake Morrison had called her over to see something unusual at the construction site. The discovery of bus number 47 had closed one chapter of her life, but opened an entirely different one, transforming her from a grieving mother frozen in time into a tireless advocate and skilled expert who could help other families navigate similar tragedies. The work was difficult and emotionally draining, but it was also profoundly meaningful. Every case she worked on, every family she helped, every answer she helped uncover was a way to honor Emma's memory and ensure that her daughter's short life had a lasting impact. As she boarded the plane to Wisconsin, Sarah thought about the conversation she would have that evening with the parents who had waited 25 years for answers about their missing daughter. She would tell them what she had learned on her long and agonizing journey. That delayed justice is not denied justice. That hope can coexist with realism, and that even the most devastating losses can be transformed into purposes that honor the memory of those who are gone. Emma would be 51 now if she were alive. She would likely have children of her own, perhaps even grandchildren. She might have become the veterinarian she dreamed of being. Or she might have found some other way to make the world a better place for animals and people. Sarah would never know what Emma's life might have been, but she knew what Emma's death had become. A catalyst for justice, a motivation for service, and a reminder that love does not end with death. It transforms into something that can reach across decades to help other families find their way through the darkness. The plane lifted off from Denver as the sun set behind the mountains, carrying Sarah towards another family, another mystery, another chance to turn tragedy into hope. Somewhere below, in the city lights, other parents were tucking their children into bed, reading bedtime stories, and believing that tomorrow would bring nothing worse than scraped knees and spelling tests. Sarah had once been one of those parents, believing in the safety of routine and the protection of love. However, she also knew that the human spirit possessed unimaginable resilience, that communities were capable of uniting in the face of adversity, and that even the most devastating losses could be transformed into an enduring legacy of hope and renewal. The veil of mystery over the bus number 47 case had finally been lifted. Yet, its impact continued to spread, manifesting in every new case solved, every family finding peace, every act of selfless service. Emma Chun, whose cherished desire was to make the world a better place, continued to bring that dream to life through her mother's tireless efforts. 44 years after her passing, and nearly a decade after her killer's conviction, some narratives conclude with the triumph of justice and the unraveling of long-held enigmas. However, the most inspiring ones bear witness to how love transforms grief into selfless service, and hope, like a phoenix, rises from the ashes of the deepest despair. Such was the story of bus number 47. Its impact resonated through time, touching the lives of people Emma never knew in life, but whom she undoubtedly would have loved, shaping a legacy capable of outliving even those who held her name in memory. Ultimately, this became the most fitting and meaningful memorial of all possible. Not monuments or plaques, but transformed destinies, aid provided to numerous families, and justice served in the name of a 7-year-old girl who genuinely believed in happy endings and, in her own way, helped bring them to fruition for others.